I'm going to go introduce our distinguished lecturer now, so we can keep the program on schedule. My name is Jessie Hill. I'm a professor and associate dean for faculty development and research here at the law school. I helped to organize the symposium along with Diana Horch and Nicole Tuszynski from the Center for Reproductive Rights. And I am now incredibly honored to introduce our distinguished lecturer, Michele Bratcher Goodwin. Professor Goodwin is a Chancellor's professor at the University of California, Irvine, with appointments at the School of Law, the School of Public Health, and the Department of Gender and Sexuality Studies. She's the founder and director of the Center for Biotechnology and Global Health Policy at UC Irvine School of Law. She's also the president of the Defense for Children International U.S. affiliate and founder of the Institute for Global Child Advocacy. Before she came to Irvine, she was the Everett Fraser Professor at the University of Minnesota, and she has also visited at the University of Chicago, UC Berkeley, and Columbia Law Schools. She's a prolific author and original public voice on civil liberties and human rights. She writes about human trafficking for sex, labor, body parts, and marriage. She writes about biotechnology, fetal protection, ART, organ transplantation, numerous areas. Work have appeared in the New England Nature, Publishers Weekly, among other journals, and she's published dozens of articles and book chapters. She's kind of one of those rare scholars who are known and respected in multiple fields at once. I think everyone kind of wants to claim her, like, no, she's a health law scholar. No, she's a race and the law scholar. No, she's a constitutional law scholar. She writes in so many areas and so well. It's really a testament not to the quality of her scholarly work, but also to its innovative and interdisciplinary nature. So I'm going to turn it over to her now. I just want to note, as she's making her way up here, we are going to take a break after this talk, probably around 2:45. We'll take a 15-minute break. It'll push everything back, but we'll still end at 4:45 because we're going to cut the closing remarks down. Thank you. Please join me in welcoming.
Thank you. Thank you so much. It's a real pleasure to be here, and I'll work on the timing too so that you don't have to cut short your closing remarks. It's a real honor and pleasure to be here. A few years ago, well, I guess maybe it was more than a few years ago, at Case, and so it's a pleasure to be back. I want to also thank, in addition to Professor Hill, Dean Hill, I also would like to thank Professor Rakaya Yerby as well for her involvement, for involving me in this conference, and as well the other conference organizers, the Center for Reproductive Rights and the justice issues that they do. I'd also like to thank the students who are here, also the staff. So I want to start off with a poem, actually, and the poem is called, and it's by Paul Laurence Dunbar. It's a poem that is being written by the wonderful poet laureate Maya Angelou. I know what the caged bird feels, alas, when the sun is bright on the upland slopes, when the wind stirs soft through the springing grass, and the river flows like a stream of glass. First bird sings and the first bud opes, and the faint perfume of its chalice steals. I know what the caged bird feels. I know why the caged bird beats his wing till its blood is red on the cruel bars. For he must fly back to his perch and cling when he faints on a bow, a swing, and a pain still throbs in the old scars, and they pulse again with a keener sting. I know why he beats his wing. I know why the caged bird sings on me when his wings is bruised and his bosom sore, when he beats his bars and he would be free. It is not a carol of joy or glee, but a prayer that he sends from his heart's deep core. but a plea that upward to heaven he flings. I know why a caged bird sings, and that was written by Paul Laurence Dunbar. And I think that it's quite fitting for this meeting, this conference today, that examines the rhetoric of reproduction, that does so in looking at the nature of assisted reproductive technology, reproductive justice issues, the intersections of race, LGBT issues as well, because there are lots of caged birds that are singing, and those caged birds happen to be women. So open up the talk about today is to think about how important the words were of Eric Holder when he came before the American Association a couple years ago, and he said, we really must pay attention to mass incarceration and the drug war. And interestingly enough, this was an issue that Republicans, along with Democrats, but it was very interesting because Republicans said, yes, we must pay attention to this issue, the drug war. And that's something, one could even say that that's a rhetoric that in 2015, or at that time a couple years ago, that everybody could embrace. But that is only after decades of not paying attention to the implications and impacts of mass incarceration, America's failed drug war, and also, let's put welfare reform on the table. But what was very interesting about Holder's speech is that in his passage that we must rethink what's happened with America's drug war policy, women were mentioned only once. It was all framed as a issue. And what was interesting is that in the aftermath of this, reporters didn't pick on the fact that women weren't mentioned, and the only space in which women were mentioned in the speech was about women being sexually assaulted. It had nothing to do with women as victims of mass incarceration, victims of our drug war, right? So women were just simply out of the picture of the Justice Department's long overdue effort to emphasize the staggering expansion of U.S. prisons. U.S. prisons have soared to account for 25% of all of the world's prisoners, even though it has only 5% of the world's population. Context, right? This gives you some idea about what it is on a mass scale. And so if we keep this in mind, then one can understand perhaps why much of the iteration has been sort of male dominant, right? So you look at this. 1 in every white males age 18 or older incarcerated. Now compare that to Latino, Hispanic males, 1 in every 36. And now let's get further down the race bar, right? Let's break it down a bit further. 1 in every 15 black males age 18 or older is incarcerated. That's pretty staggering. And so then when we talk about and we talk about the maleness, then we can understand that a bit, right? But I want to break this down further because we're going to talk about sex implications of this too. There's another view of looking at U.S. prison population by race. Keep in mind this is a little bit of an slide, right? But you can see going off the chart what these impacts look like for African Americans, and they're not great for Latinos, and they're not great for white people either. I mean, we just really rush to incarcerate. We overuse the criminal justice system as a way of resolving our concerns. Now let's begin to what this looks like by race and also by gender. All right, all men, white men, black men, Latino men. All right, so when we begin to think about women, 1 in 56 in the criminal justice system, or the likelihood of being in prison sometime in their lives. White women, 111. What does that look like for black women? 1 in 18. Women, 1 in 45, right? These figures become far more stark, and this is something very important for us to consider. Consider this, what this looks like on a global scale with regard to women and incarceration, women in the United States. So, turns out that in the United States, we incarcerate more women than anywhere else in the world. by percentage, by numbers, add the numbers together, we incarcerate more than Russia and China combined. And you can toss in a few other countries as well. Now, what accounts for this? So for as much attention as we spend on thinking about men and mass incarceration, we've forgotten about women. And it echoes a question that was raised earlier about, well, what about women? What are these kinds of impacts about these issues in this talk? So what accounts for this, right? As much as the US drug war has impacted the lives of men, it has also impacted the lives of women as well. Various forms of policing women with regard to drugs, but also policing women with regard to reproduction and their reproductive decision-making is occurring as well in the United States. So let's talk about what this means. So I want to start off with talking about what accounts for aspects of this mass incarceration and tie it into reproductive justice issues. So much of the paid to reproductive decision-making, including personhood legislation, waiting periods for abortion, state-compelled ultrasounds, concern rights with terminating pregnancies. Indeed, in the past 4 decades, legal discourse addressing women and reproduction primarily centers on, as much as the discussion has been today, on choice and autonomy, or the critique of what has been on the table today. Missing from these debates, then, is a more nuanced understanding of the constitutional liberties that are associated with reproduction that deliberates on and that recognizes autonomous decision-making in pregnancy, whether to carry to full term or abortion. But there's also reason to think why, in fact, there's been so much emphasis on abortion, and that makes sense too. Consider this. There have been more anti-abortion bills in the last 3 years than the 3 decades. Arkansas banned abortion at 12 weeks. Thank goodfully that was overturned. Georgia bans coverage for abortions for state employees, except for when the mother's life is in danger. Indiana requires pre-abortion ultrasound. The state of Wisconsin requires a vaginal ultrasound, and I can't help but thinking about that as a version of the state raping women. When else does the state require that someone has to be probed in any orifice in order to access a constitutional right? And it's not a rhetorical question, even though I know that we're here talking about the rhetoric of reproduction. Can you imagine brain probes, anal probes, or anything like that for a man who wants to obtain a gun? Or can you imagine with any other country that one might need in order to save a life, or otherwise that person is required to look at a screen while being told about what does this look like? Sure that you really want this quadruple bypass when you look at these clotted arteries. Are you sure surgery that is right for you? Right? It's unfathomable. It simply would not happen. In Iowa, low-income women on Medicaid must have their eligible abortions approved by the governor, even in cases of rape, incest, and when the mother's life happens to be in danger. Go figure. You'd think that the governor of Iowa has better uses of his time. In Michigan, no insurance plan in the state, and again, no insurance plan in the state can cover abortions at all, including in cases of rape or incest. South Dakota has a 72-hour wait period excluding holidays, right? Which then becomes more like, a 5-day waiting period. It makes it very difficult for women who happen to be low income. And the other kinds of barriers and hurdles that the Supreme Court has said would be undue burden certainly to bright relief under a 72-hour waiting period that excludes weekends and hotels. Imagine keeping that from the people in your life, right? And then the targeted restrictions on abortion, otherwise known as, have been expanded throughout the South parts of the country. So it makes a lot of sense that there's been so much attention that's been focused on abortion. That said, the continued battles over abortion crowds out what I would call the broader legal sphere of pregnancy and political challenges experienced by women who seek to carry pregnancies to term, particularly women and women of color. And because of this gap, there are at least a couple of distinct problems that emerge. First, few scholars who write about reproduction or even women and the law more generally document the pernicious forms of state-based discrimination and punishment directed at poor pregnant women, particularly because of their pregnancy status. So I'm about the work that Chiara Bridges is doing in this domain. Second, constitutional law scholars overlook and fail to interrogate the legal sufficiency of states imposing extra-legal burdens on certain classes of women, singling them out for punishment simply because they are pregnant women or pregnant women addicted to drugs. I'd really like to flag the work of the ACLU and what they've been doing in this regard. Let's think about what some of these cases represent. And here I'm not cherry picking, but instead what I hope to do is just to illuminate, to just spread on the map across the country what's been taking place on the ground. It's considered Bebe Shui's case. Just a couple years ago in Indiana, prosecutors there charged a pregnant woman with first-degree murder after she unsuccessfully attempted suicide by eating 5 packets of rat poison, claiming that this was really about her abortion. Well, of course, there are other ways to achieve a pregnancy termination rather than eating 5 packets of rat poison. Now, this also despite the fact that attempting to kill is not a crime in the state of Indiana. It is explicitly not a crime to try to kill yourself in the state of Indiana. But prosecutors singled out Bebe Shui, an immigrant from China, because she was pregnant. Now, this despite the fact that the very year that she attempted suicide, that there were 53,000 cases of similar attempts of suicide, but only she was prosecuted. Maria Guerra in the state of Texas. In 2013, she became a victim of this type of enforcement based on pregnancy. In that case, Memphis police officers arrested her. She was 4 months pregnant at the time for child endangerment and, quote, driving under the influence. Now, both very charges and allegations. Only this: Guerra was not legally intoxicated. She was, in fact, half under the limit for intoxication. Not only that, there was no child in the car. Guerra was alone in the car. There was no hitting of a pole, no running into a barrier, none of that. So half under the DUI limit, no child in the car, and arrested for child endangerment because she was pregnant. All right. Other than herself, the car was empty. We must ask then what prompted her arrest. Now, police argued that because she was 4 months pregnant, her fetus qualified as a victim of her driving. In Indiana, you know the case of Parviv Patel. She's going to serve 20 years for a stillbirth when prosecutors have acknowledged that, in fact, did not live for very long, only minutes after the fetus was born. And we could go on, and I will go, just bear with me just a little bit more. Florida, and these are all recent, just within the last couple years. Lisa Epstein, very interesting case there. Many of you, particularly with your expertise, know that in the United States, we're performing far too many C-sections in this country. The World Health Organization has flagged this as a concern in the United States. We're times as many C-sections in this country as we really should. The Lisa Epstein then becomes quite central here because in that particular case, Lisa Epstein's doctor sent her, she's a mother of 5, a threatening email. Now, what Lisa Epstein had hoped for is to have a couple of extra days because she wanted a vaginal delivery. And so she informed her doctors, look, I don't want to come in on Wednesday. I'd like to come in instead on Friday because I days. But here is the note that she received in an email from her doctor, Dr. Jerry Yankowitz, chairman of the University of South Florida's Department of Obstetrics and Gynecology. He wrote, quote, "I would hate to move to the most extreme option, which is having enforcement pick you up at your home and bring you in, but you're leaving the providers at the hospital no choice." Really? Is there no choice other than calling the police to bring her in? Seriously, really, no other choice, really, right? I mean, this puts it into context, and just a couple more, bear with me, because I think it is really worth illuminating the narratives of what's happening around the country, because as I talk with people who are deeply invested in rights and reproductive justice issues, they say, are you serious? Is this happening? Us knowing that this is happening. Christine Taylor, arrested and held for 3 days in Iowa for false steps. This is after she voluntarily sought medical treatment at the hospital to make sure that after her fall, the pregnancy was fine, revealed to the nurse that she had felt vulnerable at some point because her husband had left. In Iowa, her husband had moved back to Maryland. She's a mother of 2, single. This was enough for the nurse to interpret her fall as possibly being an attempted feticide. Police were called, and police surrounded Ms. Taylor, arrested her, put her in jail. The prosecutor attempted to find evidence that would support a charge for attempted feticide, and when they could not, then they released her. And just a couple more to put it in context, and then we can move on. Marlise Munoz and pregnancy exclusion laws. You may recall that just about 1.5 years ago, there was a woman in Texas who brain dead. Her husband and her parents wanted her to be removed from support, but in the state of Texas, just as in nearly 36 states, there are pregnancy exclusion laws, which mean that no matter what has iterated to her family or what she's left in a living will, that is overridden by the state saying that it has an interest in brain dead women gestating their fetuses, being incubators essentially for their fetus. Alicia Beltran in the state of Wisconsin. You might recall that case. This was a case that involved a seeking prenatal care who confides in her medical provider that at some point in her life she had been addicted to prescription medication but was no longer. In fact, there was no evidence whatsoever that she was using any kind of prescription medications at all. She was held for over 70 days against her will in the state of Wisconsin. Why? Because they have a law that is euphemistically known as the crack baby mama law, which was passed in the 1980s. And that law provides for the state of Wisconsin to forcibly institutionalize, incarcerate, not criminally but civilly, women for the protection of their fetuses. All right. So these are some of the accounts of what's happening on the ground with regard to women and the policing of their reproduction. And it's worth noting what this looks like after they're policed, because in some states it's permissible to shackle women who are happen to be incarcerated. Minnesota just recently repealed its law, but Minnesota provided for what's called black box shackling for pregnant women. For those of you who happen to be unfamiliar with what black box shackling happens to be, it is when shackles are around the ankles and they are around, and they happen to be then up around the belly too. And it raises the question, are there no other choices? It raises questions about the permissibility of stigmatization and shaming of. All right, so placing all of this together, then it raises questions why we have considered prisons and incarceration as just simply being about a male story. And even though the male story happens to be deeply troubling, it is really important for us to think about the ways incarceration has affected women's lives. One of our speakers earlier today mentioned something that I want to circle back on. What does this mean for children, right? Suzanne Smalley, in an article called Bringing Up Baby in the Big House, noted the dire conditions of U.S. prisons where nurseries are found. She said, quote, walk through a metal detector and a locked steel door to a courtyard surrounded by razor wire and 20-foot fences, because one of the progressive moves in this domain has been to allow women to raise their children in prison, right? And this is meant as a way to show that we have care and compassion for women being locked behind bars, right? And this is problematic. Okay, so how are children affected by this? Well, if you look at this slide, then you see that in fact, we have many, many children that are affected by this, right? Nearly 2 million children are impacted by having a parent in prison. And it's off the chart with regard to Black children who have a parent who is in prison. And it's important to talk about these issues. I should say, I want to flag the work of my colleague, Kristen Turney, who writes about how physiologically, emotionally, mentally, health-wise, the impact in the life of a child who has a parent in prison is worse than a child who's experienced the death is really quite profound, and I would strongly urge you to look at her work. And so how does this all come about, right? Well, there's a racialized picture to much of what's gone on with regard to incarceration in the United States. According to the Institute on Women and Justice, which is the leading national policy center quantitatively and qualitatively researching women in prison, the population of women in prison grew by 832%, by over 832% between 1997 and 2007, nearly twice the rate as men during the same period. Again, we don't talk about this, but look at what's happening. In fact, the rate of incarceration for drug offenses is higher for women than it happens to be for men in the United States. All right. But all of this has a kind of racialized intersection. So this billboards like this were littered literally around the country. And what it says is the most dangerous place for an African American is in the womb, right? So this carries a few different meanings, right? So explicitly, it is about, it's really the African American, the narrative about abortion, right? So African Americans are placing at risk their communities by abortion, and they're placing at risk by having abortions. That's the explicit message. But then there's also this other message that's deeply embedded in that, this sort of genocidal message about Black women. Well, it is just like so bad if you happen to be a Black child, because goodness knows you have to suffer with a Black mother. How horrible. Is there like, how dare you, right? How dare you say that the most dangerous place for an African American child happens to be in her mother's uterus? Are you serious? You know, I mean, this, in fact, what it does is it delegitimizes what genocide is really about, right? It does. And of the organizations that put this up all across the country says also quite a bit about the social acceptance of this. Who sells this billboard? Whose building is this on? Right? Those things where we say just shut it all down. But, well, no, okay, we get this. Yeah, maybe that's right. That of course not, that isn't true at all. But this is what happens also when we buy into another kind of mythology, right? And this, again, is about how the drug war and the intersections of welfare and the welfare queen come together, right? Because, after all, it's all these poor Black women who are sucking up resources of the system, who are using that crack, who are affecting and hurting the U.S. economy, that's producing these babies that will be uneducable and will be on a speedy path to prison. But this was the rhetoric of the time. Crack babies, the worst threat is mom herself. Not much different than this. Those narratives go hand in hand. It's only we don't or together at all. But it's interesting, at the height of the rhetoric about crack, headlines at the time were permissible in the newspapers of note. And here I'm talking about the New York Times, the Washington Post, the Wall Street Journal, calling black children the bio underclass, because of course that's just totally permissible. Again, it goes back to this image, right? It's totally normal to consider black kids a bio underclass, have headlines that depict them as, quote, permanently damaged. And of course, became a seductive explanation for asthma, malnutrition, diaper rash. Now, it's true. The articles, read the articles. The babies had diaper rash. They were trembling and crying. You know, babies do tremble and cry. It's amazing. And the predictions that the next year in Cincinnati, there would be nearly a 6,000% increase in the birth of crack. Wow. And I wonder, reading those, how did those ever get past editors? All of the law professors that we deal with you brilliant students, we can't get things through the law review. And how in the world do you get it through the New York Times in that way? Seriously? Right? The New York Times quoting the Wall Street Journal, quoting the Washington Post. Where is the source at all? But I have to say, and many of you in the room know, but perhaps not our viewers, some of them know, that of course it was all a myth, right? The American Medical Association and their journal, the Journal of the American Medical Association, the New England Journal of Medicine, have all come out and said we will no longer publish any or use the term crack baby because we know that it doesn't exist. There has been retraction. The New York Times, year before last, retracted articles from decades ago. Not do it in print. You remember, those of you see the video. It did it in video. And it's a great video, right? It wasn't in print. Interviewed Dr. Ira Chasnoff. Dr. Ira Chasnoff was the person who conducted a study that had a control group. Now, any of us involved with rigorous that there is no real study unless you have a control group. His study, no control group, questionable whether or not people even knew that they were in a study, which consisted of women that he documented as having had crack babies. Not distinguishing that many of these pregnancies were women who had premature births. And so the very signs that were associated with crack babies, they tremble, look at how thick and look at how small they are. These were premature babies. Now, I want to flag and highlight the work of two brilliant researchers who were shut out from mainstream discourse because they had something to say. Dr. Hallam Hurt at the University of Pennsylvania, Dr. at Emory University, two distinguished scholars who had devoted their careers to studying this area. They had something very, but it wasn't popular for politicians, and it wasn't popular for journalists who had learned that they could get front page news coverage if they told a different story. What Hallam Hurt's research revealed was that in decades worth of study, she's done the longest longitudinal study of children who've to crack in utero. Now those children are in their mid-20s, and what she discovered was that poverty has a much more significant impact on the lives of children who've been exposed in utero to crack than does crack. It's poverty. And she checked on the kids in kindergarten, checked on the kids in elementary school, checked on the kids in high school, checked on the kids actually in college. Poverty explains a whole lot. Now, I want to be here, before anybody sends me mean and nasty emails, I don't think that people should be taking crack during pregnancy at all. or meth or anything, like that. I mean, I'm a juicer. I love doing my smoothies in the morning and whatnot. Stay away from all of that. But the point being, the narrative that was so convenient about who was damaging, right? These black women who were on crack was a convenient tale. It was very convenient. The other researchers who I'd like to highlight, Dr. Claire Coles at Emory. Claire Coles had been documenting that, look, if you want to save babies that are exposed to alcohol in utero, she's like, I'm not making a choice on this, but I researched it all. And it turns out that alcohol is what we really need to be concerned about. Of course, it's white women who use alcohol more than any other ethnic population in the country during pregnancy. But of course, the ways in which this came about in the era of mass incarceration associated with the drug war is that even within the context of the same drug use, African American women were 10 times more likely to be reported to law enforcement and child protective services than their white counterparts. Drug to drug, African Americans did not use drugs anymore in any other category. It's just that they were the people who were being policed and being arrested. And the popular hysteria behind crack affects the media. Rising crack use brings parallel epidemic of neglected children, all of that, right? On the left, but think about this, racialized norms on the right. Better start in life, start cola earlier, Coca-Cola, right? Very different perspective, right? As a part of a historical narrative that's worth us thinking about, right? So now let's dive into thinking about arrests associated with female drug possession. And what I'm going to show you in slide after slide is how this has expanded over time. So we start in the 1980s, right? See around these low numbers, and we begin to go up more and more, and we began to really top off quite high, right? So that what were the low numbers down here are deeply surpassed by the time that we get up to 2011 in terms of the arrest rates for females with regard to drug possession. But this is another chart that gives you some idea of what those numbers look like. Dramatic expansion of arrests for women associated with the possession of drugs. Goldfarb wrote a wonderful piece that was published some years ago in one of the University of Iowa's law journals, and it was about the collateral damage, the effects of the U.S. drug war. And what she wanted to talk about in that was not just women and their use or possession of drugs, but also the way in which that had previously been used for mob bosses were now being used in the arrest and the prosecution of women who had been girlfriends or wives of people who had been drug dealers. And what was interesting in the article, but also what has happened in real life, is oftentimes the women were prosecuted. In fact, their partners were let off. And if you know this narrative, it's associated with the fact that the women had nobody to turn on or no one to, right? Because they're the girlfriend, they're the wife, they dropped off a package, but they don't know who the big dealer happens to be, while boyfriends and husbands do and are able to take plea deals. But I also have to say that these plea deals, when women have had to take plea deals, they also haven't worked out very well for women. So in the last few years, those of you who are tracking what's happening in Alabama know that there have been hundreds of women arrested under Alabama's child endangerment law. Alabama's child endangerment law associated with meth labs was originally intended, according to the who pushed the bill through to have nothing to do with pregnant women. Instead, it was a concern that there were children who were dying in fiery meth labs, or could, right? Or that a meth lab that's established in a home could explode. So the idea is we'll perhaps be able to discourage people from turning their homes into meth labs, with the prospect that they might be arrested if they've got a child in home. But the law has been enforced against pregnant women. And so there is a hotline, in fact, and I kid you not, it's true, there's like a hotline calling of doctors to local prosecutors when there's a woman who's tested dirty. Picking and calling prosecutors, and prosecutors have said they want to be involved in these prosecutions because they want to reduce the number of abortions in that state, and they want to save the babies. Right, and as some of you look and shake your head, like, since when is that ever the role of the prosecutor, right, to want to reduce the number of abortions in a state or to save the lives of the baby? And of course, issues and concerns about what is the role of the doctor and what is the role of confidentiality, the doctor as a fiduciary to the patient, and doctors failing to disclose that they have taken on the role as deputized law enforcers for the state. In other work, I raised the question whether or not there should be a medical Miranda. In any other case, when you know that the evidence have what you may say in this way, it's about the body as something that can incriminate, and the doctor being a fast track to law enforcement to make it happen. All right, and so this slide, and I'm going to be concluding soon, helps us to think about the number of admissions of female inmates to state or to federal prisons from 1978 to 1990. And again, what you're going to see is how we keep tipping upward, and it just doesn't end. All right, so now as we circle down to children of incarcerated mothers, here's what these numbers look like in comparison, the early 1990s to 2000, right? So those who are suffering under the weight and in the wake of all of this happen to be children impacted like at no other time before in U.S. history. This is what it looks like with regard to race. Now, if we think back to my colleague Kristen Turney and what she says, how this impacts kids psychologically, emotionally, and health-wise when they have a parent incarcerated, and that it's worse than having a parent who has died, then imagine what this looks like in the lives of Latino, in the lives of Black children, the lives of all children, right? This is another way of looking at what this appears by race. It's really stark. The likelihood of a parent in prison, again, by race. All right, so what are some of the aftermath consequences thinking about, again, when we have this toxic mixture, this mixture that's been drug war, and that's also this consistent, unrelenting push about women who are on welfare and that being deeply racialized? What is born from? So in 1997, the Adoption and Safe Families Act came into being, and it's worth thinking about what this means in the lives of those children whose parents happen to be incarcerated. So the law requires states to file a petition to terminate parental rights on behalf of any child who's been in foster care for 15 months of the most recent 22 months. Now, some people, on its face, if you weren't thinking about a drug war, and if you weren't thinking about incarceration of women during this time, 1990s, right, then you'd say, well, what child should suffer in foster care? Give that child an opportunity to be adopted. But think about this, there's no special provision for adoption. And what does that mean? The typical sentence of an incarcerated parent for a drug-related crime or charge is 80 to 100 months. So you might have away your child when you take that plea deal, right? Much of this is plea deals, right? Or when you're convicted. The Anti-Drug Abuse Act passed in 1988, then revised in 1996. It added a one-strike initiative that authorizes public housing authorities to evict tenants for drug-related activity on or off the premises. And notice in the second bullet that it allows housing authorities to evict residents for drug-related activity that they did not know about, that they could not foresee or could not control. And again, this raises the question about how girlfriends and wives have been affected by the broader drug war. The Housing Opportunity Program Extension Act, again, where the housing authority may request criminal conviction information as a screening device for housing applicants to filter out those who have been convicted. What does this happier other represent that states would like us to believe in? We'd have to say that if all of this is really about protecting the fetus, right? It's about protecting that developing person inside of women. And if this is what we do to protect them, then let's look at what those outcomes happen to be. How good is the state at what it does? So of the 400,000 children in foster care, only 4% actually live in pre-adoptive homes. Others live in group homes. They live in institutions, they live in shelters, and they live with foster family homes. Let's look at what life looks out for them when they age out of foster care. So there's a longitudinal study that's been ongoing by researchers at the University of Chicago and at the University of Wisconsin, where they have tracked children who've been in foster care. And they track these children through aging out. One of the misnomers about foster care is that kids get adopted or that it happens to be temporary. And it turns out these kids live their full adolescent lives and, youth lives in foster care, and then they dump out. So unemployed, less than 50% are employed after aging out by age 23. Homelessness, 25% homeless after exiting foster care. Pregnancy, more than 75% pregnant after leaving foster care. Convicted of a crime, nearly 60% of young men convicted of a crime, 80% arrested, only 6% had a 2 or 4 year degree. So have we done better by their parents being incarcerated and by the children being shifted off to foster care? All right. I want to thank you for having me and for this talk, and I would like to conclude this talk with another poem, and this is by Maya Angelou, and I think so appropriately because Maya Angelou, she herself experienced a quality of muteness for a number of years because she had been raped as a child. And I think a lot of people know this, but for those of you who don't, because of this rape that she experienced as a child, it was very difficult for her to articulate. And it was that which inspired her poetry as a she could not speak. And it was after being able to gain her footing in a different kind of literature and rhetoric that she was able to then amplify the voice. And so this particular poem is Caged Bird. And it picks up on Dunbar's Caged Bird, which I started with. A free bird leaps on the back of the wind and floats downstream till the current ends, and dips his wing in the orange sun rays and dares the sky. But a bird that stalks down his narrow cage can seldom see through his bars of rage. His wings are clipped and his feet are tied, so he opens his throat to sing. The caged bird sings with a fearful trill of things unknown but longed for still. His tune is heard on the distant hill, for the caged bird sings freedom. The free bird thinks of another breeze, and the trade wind soft through the sighting trees, and the fat worms waiting on the bright lawn, and he names the sky his own. But a caged bird stands on the grave of dreams, his shouts on a nightmare scream. His wings are clipped and his feet are tied, so he opens his throat The caged bird sings with trill of things unknown but longed for still, and its tune is heard on the distance where the caged bird sings of freedom. And with that, I'd like to close, and thank you all very much. And yes, I am happy for commentary and for questions. Yes.
I ran a drug court for 8 years, which is about an hour.
Wait for the mic if you would.
I ran a drug court for 8 years in Ashtabula County. Those of you not from around this part of the country, it's about an hour east of us. We have there if you're interested in drinking wine. My members of my drug court team ran a local drug treatment program called Lake Area Recovery Center. And back, it would have been 25 years ago, it was probably when, at least in this part of the country, crack cocaine was really making a disaster. Many drug treatment agencies were reluctant to take pregnant women who were crack. She did, and about 2 years ago, she showed me the photo of one of the crack baby, and she was running track at I'm not sure what college she was attending, but that was an outcome with a crack addict. So crack cocaine is not really an issue in this, at least in where I live. It's heroin and methamphetamine and cocaine. I will tell you that if I had, whether it was a man or a woman, who was using methamphetamine and they would become before me for setting bond, I would set a high bond because in about 2 or 3 months when I would see them again, either for a trial plea, they would be a changed person because they were healthy again. They put on weight. You know, sometimes you'll see meth addicts, their face is all, blotched and black from picking their skin. It's just a total turnaround. Concerning pregnant women and sentencing them, for some, that would be the only prenatal care that child would have. And I don't know if you know, but if one of my drug court participants, unless she, got kicked out or, committed a violation in the last 2 months, she was pregnant when she came to court. She was a heroin addict, and of course we tested her all the time to make sure she wasn't using. When the child was born, it was addicted to heroin, as you know. And so she would, or you may not know. Do you know that? Anybody know that? Yeah. So the child was born addicted, and Rainbow Babies and Children is whose first breath it drew was as a heroin addict. She was a white woman, and actually, of the people who've died of drug overdoses in Ashtabula County in the last year, probably about 28, I'd say maybe 1 or 2 Hispanics, 1 or 2 black, the rest were white. And this child at Rainbow Babies and Children, the child had some birth defects, don't know whether that was caused by the heroin or not, but I just thought that might be an interesting perspective.
Well, thank you for your commentary. So here we know that rehabilitation works, and yet it's not something that every state invests in at all. In Oregon and also Baltimore, there have been studies conducted with regard to women who've used drugs while pregnant and placing them in rehabilitation, and it's a much lower recidivism rate. The women are able to become gainfully employed, go back to school, etc. The problem happens to be that there is far fewer resources that are devoted towards creating beds for pregnant women, while creating making sure that there are beds for pregnant women in rehabilitation spaces, and that is a real problem. Another issue that's worth flagging because there is a rhetoric that placing women in prison provides for them to get prenatal care, and I would just urge you all to look at the Moorings piece, because in there I provide direct narratives about what life behind bars women who are pregnant, with women giving in jail toilets on concrete floors, with nurses ignoring their calls. Thinking of Arizona, because Arizona is actually quite notorious, but it was raised earlier in one of the talks. I belong to of the board of directors of an organization called Gina's Team. Gina's Team is founded by a woman named Sue Ellen Allen, and it's worth looking her up because Sue Ellen has written a memoir, and she writes op-eds about what life was like for her behind bars. Now, Sue Ellen looks like Barbara Bush, except she doesn't look like Bush, but it's all of that. And so it was for fraud that she was behind bars. Sue Ellen writes about how on that she received her mastectomy, how she was taken in chains and shackles for her breast to be cut off, the holding cell that she was in, and how horrible it was, the rats and the roaches as being very real. Now, interestingly enough, Gina's Team's not named for Sue Ellen. Instead, named for Gina. Gina was her 25-year-old cellmate, who is a mother, who died in prison after begging for medical care and medical relief. Sue Ellen was threatened with being put in the hole if she kept complaining about her cellmate's pain. Her cellmate was complaining of headaches, teeth aching. She said, when she'd bite into something, it felt like she was chewing on glass. Finally, on the day in which she was provided medical care, she went into a coma. She died 3 days later. She had undiagnosed leukemia. Why do I raise this? Our last board meeting, which was about 3 or 4 weeks ago, 2 days before the meeting, one of our grad program, we do work in prison and women graduate while still in prison, died 2 days before our meeting. She was told, and this is April, our meeting was in March, that maybe in May she would be able to see a doctor if she behaved well. And so this notion that behind bars, women are going to get a kind of quality of care that otherwise they're not allowing themselves to get when they're out is more illusory than real. You have a question, Jessie.
Oh, yes, and thank you. I think particular perspective on how mass incarceration is related to, reproductive justice, broadly understood, is really not something that we talk about enough. And I think that's, it's a really important point of view. I guess my question is, this sort of criminalization framework, right? This punitive framework we've been living with for centuries, right? Around women and pregnancy and punishing women who do what we think are the wrong things during pregnancy. It's drug context has been again and again proven not to be effective, pointless, yet it's so persistent. And I wonder, part of it, I don't know, maybe part of it relates to some of Alicia's research that she discussed this morning about, what do we think of deep down when we think about pregnancy, and, but I guess just the other, so I guess why is it so persistent? And, what is the answer in a political climate where we have no political will to deal with these problems, where there's, strained resources, I guess, at least in theory, healthcare resources that are, so on. What is there a political solution? Is there a legal solution?
This is a great question. One way of thinking about what you've just put on the table for us is that it actually is the political solution, right? So this is a political solution in a nation where narratives about bad mothers narrate throughout the last century. Let us not forget Buck v. Bell and Justice Oliver Wendell Holmes saying that 3 generations are enough. Let us not forget that in that case, which involved the forced sterilization of a young woman who happened to be white, who came from a who was raped and became pregnant out of a rape, that Justice Holmes and our U.S. Supreme Court one opinion legitimate, legal, for people who were considered socially unfit to be sterilized, because these were people who would sap the resources of the state. As Holmes said, that better than to let them want for their criminality, better than for us to have to incarcerate all of these people who would be offspring of people like Carrie, better for all the world that we give states the authority to sterilize them. And that, the Supreme Court said we see this as no different than the authority that the state has to inoculate. So there you have it. 1927, and let's not forget that the first state to adopt a eugenics law was Indiana. Indiana's been lately, right? So there you have it. I mean, I was an expert witness in Bebe Shui's case, and this is an issue that was raised earlier about who are expert witnesses and what can we put on the table. And I put that on the table. Let's unpack a whole lot, during deposition. This will be a long deposition, because we're going to go through all of this before we come up to what this case represents. And I should say the aftermath of the Bebe is that Bebe's out, and she was facing 65 years behind bars. Yes. Oh.
Thank you. I mean, it's so critical, and the jail is not a healthcare institution.
Yes.
It's something that we really have to get down with.
Yes.
But I'd also like to say, just in acknowledging this dialogue here, that the truth of the matter is that people of goodwill find themselves in desperate situations when presented with somebody who's having a difficult situation. And that's the failure of our system. It's the failure of our infrastructure, and that's the byproduct of this notion that solving our social problems is best done by criminalization.
Absolutely.
I'd just like to do a shout out, because and I
Yes.
know you covered so much ground that it was hard to do everything, but I just wanted to add to the thank yous of people, National Advocates for Pregnant Women, who did
Yes,
such a
Lynn's
wonderful
work has been great.
organizing job with Bebe Shui and Purvi Patel and I believe Epstein, and was the organization that took the call and got behind Alicia Beltran and Wisconsin.
Yeah.
I'd like to end with a question, which is the following. I want to ask the question of all of us. Is it time for us to shame the notion of criminalizing things? Is the idea that we should criminalize and use criminalization as a solution to social problems something that we should begin to challenge in a very deep way, and that that sort of take off the table? And the reason for the question is because all of the criminalization that I've seen, it's silent. It makes those who try to give aid where aid is needed, it turns them into criminals as well, aiders and abettors. And in the end, we don't really understand the problem. It gets driven underground, and we then don't come up with what's really needed to solve the problem.
I think that you're absolutely right. We can look across any number of spheres where it's very seductive to use the power of criminal law. Here's another example for you, and that is within the context of statutory rape. So most people would think, well, no, I hear statutory rape. That's an area where the criminal law should be involved, until you begin to think about the way in which that's used against children, young people who are having consensual sex. There are young people who now will require for much of what will be the rest of their lives to register as sex. It's on their driver's licenses. Many of them will be felony disenfranchised from being able to vote. They cannot live near parks, and they cannot live near schools and whatnot. And these are in cases where both say, yes, I wanted to have sex. Yes, I wanted to have sex. And example of the way in which the criminal law is used to address something that really could be about parents and their kids. Right? But instead, it's the need for the criminal law to get involved in those particular questions. I'd also say that it's worth thinking about the way in which the voice comes into these discussions, and also scapegoating. What women, how women are represented in these ways is often as a scapegoat for much of what ails our society. And scapegoat is very easy to target, right? I mean, it's about how do we picture and frame what a welfare queen is, right? She's framed as some overweight black woman who has two, right? And that's the image that was portrayed much in the 1980s and 90s. One other issue I'd flag, and then the next, that it's also worth us considering the way in which how we talk about drugs happens to also be demonized. And this is the following. There's a longitudinal study that looks at the use of prescription medications during pregnancy over time. And what's fascinating, there has not only been a dramatic rise in the use of prescription medications over the last few decades, but that rise happens to be amongst educated, wealthy white women. So much so that educated, wealthy white women during pregnancy are using up prescription medications all at once during pregnancy. And we're talking about Oxycontin, drugs like that. So why do we see these as two very different worlds? Boy, we got to be concerned about the crack, and not this other, right? Where it's morally permissible to have back pain during pregnancy. And of course, you got back pain during pregnancy. Well, that should be treated so that you can be comfortable during pregnancy. And of course, if you're stressed about the baby because of the back pain, well, then we should give you something. And that's, of course, morally permissible as well, because in fact, you should feel comfortable and happy during pregnancy. And because those drugs make you happy, let's give you some that make you happy. And all of that is totally fine. While meanwhile, we have the other women that we can point at and say, those are the women who are causing us problems. And those are the ones that we need to be worried about how their kids will impact our classrooms. So, there's another question.
You touched on something that I asked about with the Marissa Muñoz case in Texas and the state having invested making sure that baby was born. And I think it's Alabama or maybe Arkansas that now has lawyers that they appoint to a fetus. Alabama, okay. I saw it on The Daily Show, so, because that's where we get most of our news. And as a volunteer at an abortion clinic, and I've been thinking a lot lately about this sort of value that we place on women versus on the fetus versus the woman, and how we make that distinction as a society, and really what the state's vested interest in forcing a woman to give birth to a child that she would prefer not to have. And so I'm curious to hear your thoughts on that, and sort of how would it have changed if Marissa Muñoz had not had any family that would have raised the child? So what if she was a single woman who didn't have a husband, didn't have family? Would the state have been so relentless in their pursuit to force her to have the baby, even though she was in a coma, because then what would have happened to the child afterwards? So I'm just kind of curious to hear what your thoughts are on that, and sort of what is, because my thought is always, what is the purpose? Why does the state have this in forcing women to have a child? What is the purpose of this?
That's a great question. So the question, Marley's still brain dead, but without those family connections. And would the state have, well, it's legally permissible in the state for the state to have still done what it did. I mean, the state completely ignored the husband and also her parents. So in a way, you could say they really didn't exist anyway, because the state paid no attention to them. And the state continued in its enforcement of this until a judge intervened. And did so citing the fact that there were fetal anomalies, but not addressing the underlying question, which really concerns us all. And it's also worth knowing that very recently this battle has continued as a legislator in Texas has tried to now make that law even sturdier, which raises all sorts of questions for us all to think about. I've been working on a project that brings back the 13th Amendment and looking at this, which is to say that here's a version of the state engaging in slavery. Because if If her last sentiment was that I would not want to be kept on life support for any reason, and then her parents say, well, concur with that, and the husband concurs, then it's really about the state forcing her to do, right? And that's slavery, right? I mean, the state using conscripting bodies for its own purposes, that is, in my mind, just like slavery. And so I think it's to bring in these other kinds of narratives, too. I think we have a couple.
Professor Goodwin, in regard to the comment made by the young lady right there, on criminalization, you know,
Yes.
what efforts are criminalization is being used as a solution for all of our ills and what can be done. The fact of the matter that I believe is that this is America. And in America, one thing talks, and that thing is green. It's called money. You know, we can incarcerate Ohio for somewhere around $55,000 to $65,000 a year. That's not the max security inmates, that's the average inmate. And I can send them to Harvard University for about $54,000 a year. So until that dialogue comes in, when we look at the power of the dollar and the impact that the dollar has on society, that's the only time I think the Republicans and the Democrats have gotten together. I don't think that things are going to change in regard to the use of criminalization.
I appreciate your comment, and I think that that's why there is such support for Republicans who otherwise have really attacked Eric Holder, because this became a financial issue in many states where there's overcrowding, and with the conditions in prisons being so incredibly dire, that money really has mattered in that particular discourse. I agree.
This is really, mine's real quick, okay?
Yes.
You know, if I wasn't convinced, and I kind of was convinced now, I can't really take this whole idea that there's concern about protection of as the sole motive for all the cases that and examples we just heard. So, at what point do we kind of step back and say, okay, this is a microcosm of something that's happening in the whole system, and when do we start to address the real problems? Because, I mean, why is there this terrible war for poor women who are pregnant, right? I think we have to start rephrasing the question and really looking at it that way.
And I would add to that they're the canaries in the coal, because it would be a mistake to come away from my lecture that it's just about poor black women, because it's not. Exactly what happens to Lisa Epstein, who's a middle-class white woman, is the result of the fact that in the state of Florida, decades before, it became totally permissible to harass, to arrest, and to prosecute black women. It then just becomes normal to sweep in a middle-class white woman and to try that. What Lisa Epstein did phone to her lawyer, who contacted Lynn Paltrow and her organization, right? And so, great point, and leave it with canaries in the coal mine. And I think that there was time for one. Yes.
Concerning the other 49 states, I don't know the law, but in the state of Ohio, thanks to law schools like this that produce personal injury lawyers, a remedy. And I'll tell you about a case because it was a guy I sentenced for beating up his pregnant girlfriend. And we had reason to believe the infant was born. We didn't know if it was brain damaged or not, or damaged. So he got a lengthy sentence. And while he was in prison, the guards decided to, whatever, him, and he got some injuries. I mean, I don't know. It was not handled. I believe it was handled in the Court of Claims. He received a judgment probably of about $130,000. And so there is a remedy in Ohio, perhaps not in California or the other states that are represented here. Injury lawyers that are produced by this law school, where I attended when it was on the other side of Euclid Avenue, produced some, damn good lawyers. I think what I did, and it's many years ago, I found out what happy ending is that the baby was not brain damaged, as far as anybody normal, even though it had been seriously injured, as it had been mother, but the child was not damaged.
Can I there?
Oh, no, let me
in light of
finish just
time?
one more point. What I did, and I
Okay.
think this was the guy I did it. I knew he had the award because he 130 grand, and I said I would grant him judicial release prison as long as that money would be set up in a trust fund so he wouldn't squander it in the first few months of getting out of prison.
What I'd like to conclude with, and actually picking up on a bit from there, is that it actually is really important that we think about the lawyers that we're training for the future and their ability to address and work particular cases. And it's a shout out to those of us who have programs where there are fellowships and who it is that we admit into those fellowship programs. It's worth thinking about the hot spots where these cases take place. Right? They're in the Alabamas, the Arkansas, Mississippi, and places like that. It's worth thinking about people who want to come into fellowship programs who are not necessarily interested in East or being at elite schools, but instead are interested in having careers on the ground in places like Mississippi, Alabama, Arkansas, Georgia, and so forth. And I really do think that that truly does matter, because those are going to be the people who help these women who are in such dire straits be able to defend themselves against this onslaught of legislation, and where there's not legislation, this prosecutorial discretion that frames these women as bad mothers. And with that, I'd like to thank you so much, Jesse, and your colleagues.